So before we start, I would just like to take a moment to gratefully acknowledge that CHBA BC operates on the unceded traditional and ancestral homelands of hundreds of Indigenous peoples and nations across British Columbia, each with their own unique traditions, history, and culture. Thank you for joining us for today's information session to learn more about the ReHousing Research Project. I think this is timely given that the province of BC recently published a housing action plan that proposes to introduce legislation in the fall that will allow up to 4 units on a traditional single-family detached lot, or 3 depending on the size or type of lot, with additional density permitted in areas well served by transit. For today's session, we have invited the ReHousing Project team in Ontario. That's Michael Piper, Director, Master of Urban Design and Assistant Professor of University of Toronto, Jana Levitt, partner of LGA Architectural Partners, Conrad Speckert, also from LGA Architectural Partners, and Samantha Eby from Tough Lab. I'll pass it over to the ReHousing team.
Thanks, Pauline. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for that really great introduction. We're going to be speaking today about an ongoing project, which is some research that looks closely at the, sorry, there's some reverberation there, that looks closer at suburban zoning and proposes designs for low-rise neighborhoods to add infill housing. The project has been funded by the Neptis Foundation and is a close collaboration between the University of Toronto and LGA Architectural Partners. It's the kind of partnership I think we all really enjoy, in that it's a combination of practice and academia, which allows both to contribute and enrich each other's work. The ReHousing project explores ways to create multiplex housing on single-family lots. The project focuses on small-scale transformations to individual properties, so not looking at anything where land assembly is required, and we focused on phasing in additions and improvements over time. As the population grows, cities across Canada are looking for ways to increase the number of units available to help with increasing affordability issues. We believe that this is a great opportunity to look at existing housing stock to make space for more than one family per house. When we look at the City of Toronto's land use map, about 50% of the land is zoned exclusively for residential use. And of this, 2/3 is zoned exclusively for single detached houses. So there's a great opportunity here. When you look at the aerial slide, it really captures the result of this kind of restrictive zoning. You can see all along the major corridors, avenues and transit corridors, there's tall buildings. And then surrounding that, like a mat, is primarily single family housing. So there's a lot of area to be explored. We're going to give you a brief context for the policy lands work that we're working within. So I'm going to walk through a history of the rules that are going to enable new units in single family lots. In 2000, the City of Toronto passed legislation which enabled homeowners to add a secondary suite to their lot. This enabled the creation of a second unit within the provided it was smaller than the primary unit. Most commonly was the second unit was most commonly built as a basement suite. This required additional fire separation, exiting and daylight requirements, and a minimum ceiling height of 1.95 meters. In 2018, the city approved laneway suites across the city on properties that shared a property line with a public lane. This is a condition that's not uncommon in the downtown parts of the city, which is great because now it allows 3 units on the lot, 2 in the main house and 1 at the back of the lot, provided it met very specific guidelines, which enabled proper emergency to the rear unit. These are typically called accessory units or granny flats. In July 2022, the city increased the number of sites that could build ADUs by passing the garden suite legislation, removing the requirement for the lot to back onto a laneway. That actually opened up far more sites, single family sites in the city, to having secondary units. In November, the provincial government of Ontario passed a new law that enabled 3 units as of right on the lot in cities over 100,000. This could be either 3 units in the main house or 1 in the backyard and 2 in the main house, but placed limits on the ability to expand the envelope of the house to accommodate this. Most recently, the City of Toronto has a draft legislation before the council that would enable 4 units in the main house and 1 on the rear lot of the house, either a laneway suite or a garden suite. Most of these policy changes are being pushed forward by an internal team at the City of Toronto called EHON, which stands for Expanding Housing Options in Neighbourhoods. The goal of EHON initiative is to facilitate more low-rise housing in residential neighborhoods to meet the needs of our growing city. This includes simplified as-of-right zoning, simplifying approval processes, reducing financial barriers to small-scale development, and expanding multiplex permissions to more areas across the city. The proposed policy change is based on the idea that you should be able to build a multiplex to the same size as you can build a single-family house. Currently, in the limited area where you're able to build multiplexes in Toronto, they have far more restrictive guidelines than those of single-family houses. The multiplex scope proposes to standardize form-based zoning to allow up to 4 units on any lot and introduce a single low-rise residential zoning for up to 4 units in a building. This study became the jumping off point for our research project. And now I'm going to hand it over to Conrad.
So there's been a lot of press and media attention, obviously, on the subject of missing middle zoning and housing across North America. We'll start off with a quick jurisdictional scan. This is similar to a presentation done at CHBA National earlier this year, where we kind of will work our way across the country, looking at Edmonton, Victoria, Vancouver, and then, of course, Toronto, which is the scope for this work. So in August of 2019, Edmonton City Council approved changes to zoning bylaw that allows a lot more diverse housing to be built in existing residential areas. And generally, Edmonton has consistently been ahead of other Canadian cities in terms of upzoning, approvals, speed, and accommodating growth in existing neighborhoods. Edmonton previously had rules that set a maximum of 4 dwelling units per lot, which is what Toronto is now proposing to do. But the new RF3 zoning essentially deletes any specification of a maximum number of units. So now one is really constrained by the form-based building size and minimum unit size only. And the diagram on the left, for instance, shows how 6 units could be arranged on a single lot. We'll just say that in general in this presentation, there's a lot of charts and tables, and we don't spend enough time on the slides to go through that in detail. But the intent, of course, is that this will be provided to you as a copy afterwards to dissect and more closer up. And Edmonton also, when they were doing this upzoning and missing middle reforms, did a really interesting sort of design competition that kind of sets a different way of thinking about suburbs and the future of suburbs in Canada. Then, of course, Victoria, that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, recent missing middle housing initiative, which was approved in January and sort of officially marks the end of what one might call exclusionary zoning in Victoria. One of the key takeaways for us from Victoria is that they distinguish between mid-block and corner lots. The rules recognize that corner lots get more light or easier for firefighters to access, have a lot less concern for privacy, and hence can handle more housing than mid-block lots. And so this is a summary of the new bylaw. The blue on the right is sort of the existing conditions, and the 3 columns on the left show the mid-block, corners, and a slightly more restrictive rules for heritage areas. And allowing up to 12 units on corners, up to 6 units on mid-block conditions, maximum building height has changed. Setbacks are standardized. And then there's some rules as well about making sure that units are sort of family friendly with at least 3 bedrooms. And then the city also has done an interesting thing with FSI and sort of density incentives to create more affordable housing. And then much like Victoria, the city of Vancouver is also looking at missing middle reforms. Of course, City of Vancouver's zoning right now is a bit like Toronto. More than half of the city is zoned for residential use, limited to single detached zoning. And the proposed changes don't distinguish corner lots, but they do distinguish by the width of the lot. 4 units everywhere, 6 units on wider lots. And on the left here, there's a kind of illustration of what's currently considered gentle density options and what's being proposed as sort of multiplexes. And one of the interesting things as well that we always want to include in our presentation is what Vancouver is discussing in terms of FSR, which in Toronto gets termed FSI, which of course is the floor space ratio, how much floor area you can build relative to the lot area. And what Vancouver's proposing is not just to standardize or harmonize FSI between a house, a duplex, a multiplex, but actually to incentivize building multiplexes instead of larger houses, increasing the as of right permitted FSI for them. And Vancouver is moving ahead with this work that's kind of scheduled to take effect next year. And I'll pass it on to Michael.
Hi, everybody. Here's a link to our site. Please check it out. If you can go to the next slide, Conrad. So our project began by assessing recommendations that the city's working group, EHON, had made for creating multiplexes. And one of the big issues that we learned was that design and research, building research exploration to that date had focused primarily on the kind of downtown context. So this drawing, which if you scroll down on our website, you'll see samples a series of context from across the city. And so the goal here is to take a kind of a regional perspective towards densifying single family neighborhoods. Next, please. So to get a better sense of the home types across Toronto's suburban region, we spent a good deal of time on real estate websites, finding examples of homes that were commonly listed. Indeed, as you can see on the bottom left, the floor plans that we found on these sites were actually how we ended up drawing floor plans for many of the homes that we identified across the region. So we have a kind of exhaustive list of, or exhaustive listing of homes on our website for all the various types we found. Next, please. So based on some ongoing research about different types across the region, we identified these kind of distinct categories of homes based on their age of construction. And so I guess the point here being is that, based.
Oh, Michael, you're muted.
Apologies.
There we go.
I'm not sure where I started being muted, but I'll start with the slide at the beginning. So based on some ongoing research about home types, we identified different categories based on age of construction. And the point here is that different home types offer different types of opportunities for densification for multiplexes. So as you can see on the left, the homes built before 1941 generally are on narrower lots, tend to have relatively high lot coverage. And so we found a lot of our kind of conversions were taking place within the existing building envelope, notwithstanding laneway construction or garden suite construction. In the middle is a post-war generation between 41 and 67. And with these types, you'll find the lots are much larger. The building types take up less of the lot space. There's room for additions, either attached ADUs or detached ADUs. And the buildings themselves are larger, which enables for more units to be converted within the interior building. And as you'll see, this building type, I think, kind of offered some of the greatest opportunities for densification for the size of this lot, but also because it really constitutes a majority of the kind of residential development in Toronto. On the far right is what we're calling the Metroburb generation from 67 to 92. These are larger buildings built on smaller lots, and a lot of our designs focus on kind of interior reconfigurations for this type, which Sam's going to detail in a bit more. Well, Sam will offer more details about. You'll see that this building actually, we were able to convert from a single unit to 5 units with up to 9 bedrooms. Next, please. So in all, we identified 13 housing types distributed across the region. The black dots, of course, are these types. And on our website, you can see these all listed. And again, the goal here is that to demonstrate density strategies for a range of home types in different geographies. Next, please. Here's a few of these types with a range of typical lot dimensions, detached, semi-detached housing, and different kind of orientation and placements of garages. So these are some of the kind of variables we identified with the houses during our analysis. Next, please. So after building our typology, we then developed a housing catalog based on cost. So for each of these 13 home types, we developed a series of designs that range from kind of low cost interior renovations to medium cost, where there may be an addition, to high, and then all the way to kind of demolition and reconstruction being the most expensive. Next, please. And so to just offer a few examples of what we're talking about, here you can see low-cost designs focusing on interior renovations. These are, basement suites, new interior partitions within the principal dwelling that create multiple units. The medium being maybe the addition of a laneway suite or an attached ADU. A high being here you're seeing an addition to the top of the building, slightly more costly, but yielding a kind of new unit above. And then on the far right is actually one of LGA's, Jana's projects, Ulster Condos, which is kind of a higher cost intervention where you're demolishing the existing building and replacing it. And I'll be passing it over to Sam.
All right, so we don't have time to look at all 13 types, but we wanted to show you a couple of them now. So to start, this is the post-war bungalow, which has a 125 feet by 40-foot site. And this one in particular is located in a suburban area of Scarborough. The orange box shows what the current zoning rules allow for the building size of a new house. And basically, like we've mentioned before, the premise of this project is that we think you should be able to put a multiplex with 4 units inside that box, not just a big house. So on the next slide here, there is the existing floor plan of the bungalow and an elevation of it in context. And very conveniently, this site that we picked, if you notice 2 doors down, there's actually the small post-war bungalow has been torn down and a big mansion has been built that basically fills out the maximum amount of that zoning site. And I think this is like a really good example that if you can build a house that's that big for one family, you should be able to build one that has a few more units in it. So we wanted to show you the high option. And so this option for the post-war bungalow adds a garden suite in the backyard and a side addition in the existing driveway and a renovation in the basement that introduces a series of light wells that act as entry courts and get some nice light down there. So in total, this building now has 5 units, 4 in the main house and 1 garden suite, and a total of 9 bedrooms. On this next slide is this is rendering, visualizing the existing condition of the driveway of this house, and then a view of what that high-level renovation could look like. And so you can see the laneway house in the backyard and one of the entry courts that gets light down into the basement along the side. So the next slide should be the new version of this same bungalow site. So this is a 3-story multiplex with 4 apartments that are built in its place. And so we end up with 5 units again, but this time 13 bedrooms. And the intention and one of the opportunities that is much easier when you do a new build site is that you can accommodate accessibility much easier. So if we flip to the next slide, there are basically two ways that you can design a multiplex, either as stacked townhouses where each unit has its own separate exit on ground level, or as a small walk-up apartment building where the units are stacked and share an exit door. It's typically more profitable to design townhouses than stacked plexes because you can sell the floor area of the stairs because they're inside the unit. The building code in Canada says that plexes require 2 means of egress, which makes them less efficient to build. This is a passion of Conrad's. Some of you might be aware if you've heard one of his previous webinars. But we'll get into this in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. We only want to kind of mention this to say that there are other important rules besides zoning that have serious consequences for how we build, some of which we'll get to a little bit later. So moving on, this is the second example, which is a post-war semi. These are really typical out in the suburbs of Toronto. And here again, we're showing in yellow the maximum buildable envelope. In the high version, which is now on screen, we are able to renovate this into a 5-unit, 8-bedroom house. The garage has been converted into a living space and the top addition has been added for a larger rear unit. In the new version, which I think should be on the next slide, there are 2 units in the basement and a pair of 2-story stacked units on the top, again, utilizing that sort of change in the ground plane to get some extra light down into the basement. And so with this unit, we were able to take a single family house and make it 5 units again, this time with 11 bedrooms. And this is only at 2 stories. So really unoffensive in terms of the amount of volume you're introducing within the neighborhood. So just to actually visualize that for you, here is the existing example what one of these houses would look like. And then the next slide is the 2-story multiplex. So again, 11 bedrooms, 5 units in that volume. So the final example we want to look at is that of a Metroburb house. We like to call this one a snout because of the way the garage sticks out in front. And so this scheme that we're showing is a high-level scheme that converts a 1-bedroom or 1-unit 4-bedroom house into a 5-unit house with 4 in the main body of the house and the garage converted to a standalone unit in the front. Where there used to be a large roof over the garage, this has been transformed into a private terrace for the upper unit, and the garage unit has a private entrance that you can see. And just in front of the front porch, you can see the entry court that takes you down to the building on the right. So these subtle changes in the building form have a huge impact on the ability to provide space for multiple families when working in this within the scale of the neighborhood context. Those were just a few examples from our catalog to give you an idea of what we've been working on. Here's a screenshot from the housing catalog that shows you on each one of those projects, the sort of 4 iterations of design that we've done on the website. So after we finished assembling our housing catalog, we reached out to the EHON. So that's again, the Expanding Housing Options and Neighborhood team at the City of Toronto. And they selected 3 of our design schemes and we provided a full architectural drawing set showing how these buildings do not conform with the existing zoning regulations. We also then redesigned some of the buildings to conform with the zoning regulations on setbacks, building height, roof geometry, landscaping, and floor space index. And so this is actually just a chart of the 3 schemes and everything that was in yellow in our original design, which we thought was superior to the compromised one, were the variances that we were looking for in each project. So the city released a draft of their zoning bylaw for multiplexes a few weeks ago, and it includes most of our recommendations. And as part of their public consultation, they've been using our drawings and diagrams to explain these changes. So right now, actually very recently, there's been a draft of the legislation that's been put forward or that's going to be put forward to council. And so we are hoping that it will be passed in May of 2023, which is coming up very soon.
So I'll jump into a couple of the recommendations that we had compiled for the city. It's been interesting since we put this presentation together in the last 3 weeks, seeing what the city's come out with. So we'll go through some of those. The main one, and the city had again identified this early on, was standardizing and harmonizing the rules between the building size allowed for a single detached house versus a multiplex. We had always drawn sort of taking, the rules currently actually say that a multiplex cannot have a building depth exceeding 14 meters, whereas a house can be 17 meters. And so we had taken the assumption of drawing all the buildings at 17 meters. Another thing that the city hadn't recognized early on was that there was similar language, or sort of published early on, was that there was also issues around side yard setbacks, that regardless of the number of units in a house or a building, a multiplex, a fourplex, for instance, had to have a larger side yard setback than a single detached house. And from our perspective, it's a question of building form, not building occupancy in that sense. One of the other ones that we had flagged was the restrictions that the city has on roof geometry that make it really tricky to try to make a third story. And interestingly, in December, a long-standing, I think it's been about 10 years, that an appeal with the Ontario Land Tribunal has been finally issued their final order, which essentially strikes down those main wall height restrictions. And so now, even without the work of EHON, a 3-story building can be done so long as the third floor is set back 1.4 meters. One of the other things, of course, we flagged, which really pulls from what the City of Victoria has done, is distinguishing between mid-block conditions and corner lots, and also suggesting that on corner lots, one might consider other uses beyond residential, like ground floor retail and commercial use, which, of course, if anyone has ever visited Montreal, is quite familiar and normal. Another thing is that when we start to get into designing the front yards and rear yards, realizing that it's actually quite tricky to meet the soft cover landscaping percentages that the city requires, and we think there should be alternative means of measuring what that soft landscaping performance is, because it's really about stormwater retention capacity, not an aesthetic function. And so if a design proposes green roofs, permeable pavers, or things that are alternatives to sort of asphalt parking spaces, there should be a performance-based way of considering that soft cover landscaping, because again, it really is supposed to be about stormwater retention capacity. Another thing is, in some of the early discussions with Victoria Council, there was a notion of forbidding basements. And we think that instead of forbidding the construction of basements, the legislation should essentially incentivize multiplexes without basements. The argument here, of course, being the embodied carbon footprint of the concrete bathtub that one builds. And so allowing additional building height for slab-on-grade construction was something that we had discussed. Another thing is that sometimes in the zoning bylaw, there's a nuance around the way mezzanines are considered. In the building code, of course, a mezzanine up to 40% of the floor area of the story below is not considered a story, but sometimes in zoning bylaws that's misinterpreted. And so we think the zoning bylaw should defer to the building code on the interpretation of a mezzanine. Another thing, and this came out of looking at the ways that certain municipalities, City of Vancouver, for instance, has its density bonus incentives to incentivize more sustainable construction. And one of the things we looked at is that the thickness of continuous exterior insulation can actually add up to quite a significant amount of floor area on a 2- or 3-story building. And so as part of FSI, the notion of certain density bonuses like that was discussed. What's interesting is that in the last 3 weeks, the city has proposed that multiplexes will be exempt from FSI. And so the approach of creating bonuses has now been superseded by really focusing on form-based zoning and exempting multiplexes from FSI. which from our perspective, we think is fantastic because a lot of the designs, most of the designs exceeded the FSI limits on the site as of right anyways. Another discussion that we'd had was around incentive, like the treatment of a renovation versus new construction. And the city has clarified that in the official plan amendment that they've proposed, that the form-based zoning should apply equally. So some of the key highlights from what's come out recently is that building depth is actually to be increased from 17 meters to 19 meters. This is quite interesting because it could then allow for a light well coming down the center of the plan, certainly a lot more flexibility in bedroom sizes, and only doing so for lots with beyond a certain depth and width. Exempting multiplexes from the number of stories and really focusing just on maximum permitted building height, and setting that permitted building height to 10 meters, because there's many neighborhoods, for instance, certain neighborhoods with bungalows, built in the 60s and 70s have a height overlay map that makes it impossible to build any building higher than a bungalow as a new construction today. And so the proposal is to exempt multiplexes from those height overlay maps. The big one, of course, being the exemption from FSI and applying the rules equally to new builds and additions. Then, as Sam alluded to, and I had previously given a presentation to CHBA National about, LGA has submitted a building code change to the Canadian Code Commission on Building and Fire Codes. Because part of the research we've done is to read through building codes of over 30 countries around the world. And with the exception of Uganda, Canada is the most restrictive jurisdiction in the world for the maximum building height with one staircase. So even in the United States, for instance, you can build, according to the International Building Code, you can build a 3-story building with one staircase, maximum of 4 dwelling units on each floor. And the main alternative fire safety measure is that you're sprinklering that building, whereas of course a row of 3-story townhouses would not have to be sprinklered. And so this is a code change that we think would have a really big impact on the financial feasibility, the quality of life in multiplexes. And for anyone that's curious and wants to read more about it, to compare the building code in Canada to other countries and see the alternative fire safety measures that are proposed. Yeah, there's just a quick little diagram on that. And this is an example from the state of Washington State of a corner lot multiplex with a single exit stair. And you'll see the kind of efficiency of those floor plans that's feasible because of that. Another discussion that we had with a couple of architects that have been working on multiplexes is the issue of sidewall construction. If you're building a 3-story detached house, the sidewalls do not need to be non-combustible construction. They just need to have an hour fire rating. Whereas a multiplex requires those sidewalls to actually be non-combustible construction. And so that is often done as a steel stud framing, which then adds more complexity and cost because you have 2 different distinct above grade structural systems. And a lot of architects feel that a smarter, more performance-based measure would be to require those walls to be a 2-hour rating, but allow them to be made in the same method of construction as the rest of the building. And the diagram on the right, which is a wall section, just shows how silly this can get sometimes, where you have a wood frame floor assembly framing into a steel stud wall assembly, clearly not actually performing as a kind of intended, sidewall construction. And then another nuance, which actually we learned from Mark Bernhard at CHBA BC, is some issues around the Canadian Electrical Code. And there's 2 discussions here. One is that in Ontario, where the Ontario Electrical Safety Code has interpreted the Canadian Electrical Code differently than, for instance, Technical Safety BC. What we mean by that is that there's load reduction factors when you're calculating your electrical load that typically come into play, so that a single detached house must calculate all 100% of the load, but additional units in a duplex, triplex, fourplex each additional unit has a load reduction factor. In Ontario, however, the OESC has issued a bulletin clarifying that that only should apply to buildings of more than 5 units. And so for a fourplex, one essentially has to calculate 100% of all loads on at all times. And what that results in is a 400 amp electrical panel upgrade, which can be very expensive and tends to perpetuate the use of natural gas systems, and obviously has a whole bunch of sustainability and carbon emission knock-on effects. So park that Ontario specific issue of the way the OASC interprets the electrical code, because you guys don't have that problem in BC. But there's another larger issue at hand of the way that electrical load calculations are in fact calculated, in the sense that they are about 30 years old and really don't reflect the current efficiency of appliances, lighting, or the use of homes today. And we think that looking at the way other jurisdictions do this, and knowing that utilities don't in fact want to now have to upgrade the grid in areas they know are not using the load today that has been built out at, we think this needs to be something that across Canada is going to need to be addressed to make these multiplexes viable, because the cost of transformer and electrical panel upgrades is really significant. And then the last note is on the financial side and taxation side is last summer in the City of Toronto, City Council in the same session had approved an increase of development charges by about, I guess, 50%, which in that same session, however, they exempted projects with up to 4 dwelling units from any DC charges. And so essentially overnight on June 28th, 2022, the financial feasibility and competitiveness of building a multiplex changed completely. And that was a move that really incentivized this type of construction by essentially removing, I think, just under $300,000 in development charges for these types of projects. I'll leave it at that. There's a couple of key issues that we thought we'd raise as sort of things for discussion with you, but we're really curious to hear your thoughts and questions. Again, it was interesting when we did this work because we had been looking at things that were happening in Victoria and in Vancouver and across in the US as well to kind of learn from. And so now giving that presentation back to some people in BC is a nice kind of full circle moment for us, I think.
So Conrad, in terms of the Q&A, I noticed that we do have some questions within the Q&A box that touch on these key issues that you've identified. So I wonder maybe if you want to just jump into renovation versus new build as one, and then the parking component. Those are the 2 questions that got asked.
Yeah, who wants, should I take the parking question, or Sam, do you want to take it? Who wants to do parking? We always get the parking question.
Yeah, I mean, so one thing that the City of Toronto made a very deliberate decision to remove minimum parking requirements from these developments. I think historically this has been a huge barrier to them being able to be built due to lot restrictions and how much room parking takes up. And so what they've done is they've not said that like you can't have parking or that there won't be parking, but they have removed the minimum requirements, which I think is a really, from our perspective, a really great thing. That means it's on the onus of the person who's developing the project to determine what parking they actually need. In terms of our design, if there was an existing garage condition in any of the houses we were looking at, we tried to provide an option that left the garage as existing parking space, while also maintaining a driveway that would hold parking for at least 1, if not 2 spots within it. And then show a version where if the garage wasn't needed as parking or storage, that it could be converted into additional unit space. So that's kind of where our stance on parking is being derived by, which is like a deliberate policy decision from the City of Toronto.
Sorry, I just want to add to that, that one of the interesting things about this study is that depending on the suburb that we looked at and when it was developed, as Sam was saying, you could actually fill in the garage part of the existing building and still provide some parking on the site. Whereas in the older parts of the city, say in the old downtown of the city of Toronto, many times there is no parking at all. So I think it's very instructive for people in other provinces to look at the range of housing, because I think some of the newer suburbs are probably more relevant to the areas that you're working in.
There's a question on how do we account for cost variables and stuff, and I thought maybe that's something, Michael, if you want to talk about the next phase of work, because for this phase, that was one of the things is initially we realized we were doing this work at peak of inflation last spring. So we decided to just do relative costs. And so that's why the low, medium, high, and new is a kind of dollar sign relativity, because to actually put specific numbers on it at that time was not good, was also perhaps not going to be relevant, because we didn't know where inflation would be a year from now, but I'm sure Michael can talk about next work.
Yeah, Tamara, this is actually exactly what we're focusing on now. I think one of the things we recognized with kind of a high level assessment was, renovations have the possibility of being more cost effective if existing conditions are kind of if the existing building's in good shape. And so the challenge that we're finding, or that we're recognizing, is that every time you approach a new building to renovate it to a multiplex, you're going to deal with a variety of existing conditions. And so the question is that we're looking at now is there a way to kind of simplify and make somehow more predictable renovation processes? And so we're approaching this from kind of a component-based approach, which is looking at kind of standardizing different elements for a home renovation, fire separated wall with sound insulation, bathrooms, kitchens, that sort of things, and trying to maybe find a format that allows us to streamline this approach. I missed one point that I had meant to say earlier. Our assumptions about kind of these renovations being more cost effective than the new builds actually stems from a ULI report the City of Toronto ULI chapter did to kind of study. They did pro formas for comparable building types for renovations and replacements, and found that per square foot costs for renovations were significantly lower. So again, the challenge being how do we make this somehow more predictable, and that's really a question that we are looking at now.
Just to kind of jump on that, another thing that we really tried to do with the series of levels of design intervention was think about them with phasing in mind, like the idea that if you were to buy a house to convert to a multiplex, you may not be able to afford to build the high level phase right away, but you still need to be able to convert something into for a unit thing at the beginning. And so looking at kind of what's the lowest level intervention, but always planning the designs in a way that takes into consideration how you could maximum build out that envelope, so that they could be done kind of like as a series of phases. And I think the intention with that was really to create different access points into being able to build it, because a lot of people who are looking for different forms of housing as a means of like finding more secure housing, whether that's through ownership or new rentals, aren't able to afford to tear down a house, pay back the cost of the mortgage on that part of the house, then get a mortgage to build a brand new house all over. And so I think part of the idea of focusing on renovations was to one, from the carbon perspective, which is really important, but also look at different access levels into the project. I'm also I saw Lisa asked a question of if there was an idea to make all of these rentals, or if there's some consideration for making them strata or other forms of ownership. That's definitely something that we've been considering. We've been looking at a kind of series of different pathways of doing this, whether this is we're working with real estate people who are focused on co-housing and talking with banks about people who are looking to co-purchase. Ontario has more strict mortgage laws, and strataing the houses is a little more complicated than it is in BC. So we're kind of like hoping to find ways to break down some barriers to that, but also looking at this as a way that people who are house rich and cash poor can access and leverage the equity that they have in their existing house, either through sale or the creation of new rental units.
Just to follow on what Sam said, there was also a really, we thought, interesting relationship between providing multiple access levels for people to acquire housing or to develop a multiplex with family members or a group of friends, was to demonstrate that if you can think through the end and forecast the end point, then everything that you do up until then, it's an additive process. So that bathroom or that kitchen that you add initially or in the second stage never has to be torn out and wasted, or the investment wasted. You're always in a process of moving forward, improving the value of your property. And I would say, as a group of architects on the team, demonstrating the value of good design as part of the value added for this way of developing a house.
Yeah, sorry to pile on. I think this is one of our favorite points of discussion. We spent a bunch on. I don't have a lot to add because I think that Sam and Jan have covered it, but we're actually working now with a local community land trust who manages single family homes in Toronto. And it's interesting because they kind of hold these homes, they hold these homes, they're not going on the market. So they have the ability to think long-term about them, as maybe a homeowner might who's staying there. And they're not yet able to do some of kind of a full multiplex renovation. So what we're doing is talking to them, we haven't yet dug into the work, about how to locate things like kitchens and bathrooms to make sure that if you do an add-on later, that kitchen or bathroom isn't in the way. So a kind of design exercise, thinking long-term about how to create a multiplex rather than, the kind of immediate design that would be the immediate kind of approach that we've used to make a kind of a new build design.
I'm not sure if there are any kind of other specific questions we want to address, but I think like a kind of core concept for us is challenging the idea of housing creation as a finished product and thinking of it as something that people have the ability to adapt as their housing needs change, and the potential of introducing multiplex legislation as a means of allowing people to stay within their local communities as their needs change, I think is a really important potential from the social side of this. There's a question about increased air quality challenges between units in the chat. I mean, I think one of the things that building code has specific requirements about once you get over a certain number of units, you're not allowed to share air. So designing the systems in a way to isolate individual units is kind of like an important thing that's also enforced by code at certain levels.
One of the other things, I guess I'll just add on, is that the Ontario Building Code has updated with more stringent acoustic isolation requirements as well, that I think really lends itself to this, realizing that when you're building a multiplex or doing a renovation for a multiplex, you're required to provide an acoustic isolation between the units that really makes them, you know, regardless of your neighbor's behavior, a lot more livable than I think some people's, conventional assumptions about living where you're sharing a wall, obviously in buildings that were not built to the current code, comes with certain concerns. But these buildings built to the code now will have to have stuff that really addresses that.
I have a question, actually. Adam in the chat said if anyone's interested in seeing this in practice, look in the city of Kelowna. And I'm just wondering, you said that you did an amendment to the zoning. Was that to respond to a great interest in the construction of multiplexes? Has it been well received?
Hello, it's hard to tell. Can you hear my voice?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, there were some implications on the market where land prices went up overnight on all the exact properties. But there are details like garbage and recycling, as well as parking, to be worked out. And our recommendation we've seen was that lots with lanes is much easier to accommodate infill housing, especially 3 or 4 plexes, because you can be able to handle the garbage and recycling within garages that access off the lane. And then it's easier to accommodate the new infill, especially when you only require 1 stall per parking. As soon as you go lots without lanes, then accessing the garbage and recycling and some of the details like that on long street levels get complicated, especially if you don't require parking, and especially if you don't provide parking, then garbage and collection can get quite messy on the street if they're parked constantly. So we are currently exploring pre-zoning land without lanes. So we've got 4 or 5 years under our belt, and we've probably had 30 fourplexes built since 2018. And so far, I think the community has not freaked out, and it's been really well received. I personally live in one, and it's I think we've done it's been pretty well done here. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
There's an interesting question from Gail about, and Conrad, maybe there's a larger discussion about kind of electrical systems for the house that maybe part of this question speaks to, and then another is storage. I don't know if you all would like to take it.
Yeah, on the storage note, so for some of the sites, actually, we found that there was enough, the lot was wide enough, and we were able to do 3 stories that we could quite easily provide 4 units. I think in most cases, all of the, or, a 1 bedroom, a 2 bedroom, and 2 3 bedrooms, or something like that. But a good mix of units. And then in the basement, just leave that as storage, sort of storage lockers for each unit. Which is quite common to do in other countries and areas where this type of living, sort of small multi-unit buildings, is common, is that the basement gets used as kind of a storage space or a common workshop or utility space. And on the note of concrete basements, I mean, I have a separate sort of tangent that I could go down, which is the question of whether that basement actually needs to be concrete wall assembly, given that the building code allows pressure treated wood foundations. But that's for another day. But I think the most obvious thing is that to disincentivize doing the concrete bathtub and just doing a slab on grade, which then also incentivizes making that ground floor an accessible unit, is to really allow not 10 meters in building height, but 12 meters in building height. Because then you can build, you know, a Part 9 building with a mezzanine or whatnot. And certainly it pencils out again quite well. On the note of the heat pumps and electrification, as we've seen on a project in our office, the big issue there is the way the electrical code requires you to calculate. And so what's interesting is that in some of these cases, a 5-unit building would actually have had a smaller electrical load than a 4-unit building because of the load reduction factors that they allow. Again, that's an Ontario specific problem, but we've seen that in other jurisdictions, the assumption even on a single detached house is not that you're going to be, you know, using your oven, your air conditioner, and your dryer and charging your electric car at the same time, and that if in the worst case scenario someone might do such thing, your breaker would trip and you would learn to never do that again. And so in fact, we've oversized our electrical panels in Canada based on an understanding and a sort of use of electricity that no one is really in fact doing. And then on the question of e-bike and electrical car charging, you know, there's electrical load management systems that essentially you put your dryer and your car charging on the same circuit, and it picks one or the other can run at the same time. And that's a system that costs $400, $500, I believe, instead of paying $10,000 for a panel upgrade. Some provinces recognize those systems and allow them. Ontario, as far as I understand, does not. So yeah, there's answers here, but it seems that the regulations aren't catching up with it fast enough.
There's an interesting question from Joseph in the Q&A that says, is 3 units enough per lot? Do we need to target 4+ units? And so the City of Toronto right now is actually targeting 5, so 4 in the house and 1 on the back of the lot. One of the things that we thought was really great about what was happening in both Vancouver and Victoria was like looking at specific lot conditions and having different levels of density depending on where they are. So like lots closer to transit potentially could benefit from higher density that have greater width. I think could definitely handle higher density. There's a couple of demonstration projects that we have within the housing catalog where we've actually shown that you could fit a 6-unit multiplex within the zoning allowable envelope on some of the post-war sites. And so there's definitely room to do that depending on what type of housing you want. It's just a sort of question of what's appropriate based on the broader conditions. And yeah.
I'll maybe mention as part of that, I don't think maybe putting a limit on the number of units is, I guess I would say clearly we would favor kind of raising the limits or eliminating the limits and maybe relying on built form as a guide. However, that being said, something to consider that we looked at, and Sam mentioned this earlier, was imagining the kind of different scenarios that could yield the multiplex, whether that be a small developer who maybe would do well to increase as, you know, to get as many units as they might be able to get on site versus, you know, a homeowner who's can only afford to build a couple units to maybe supplement their mortgage. And so we kind of identified these different scenarios, and part of doing this sort of low to high design series was to facilitate and imagine these different scenarios so that people with different kind of finances could engage in the practice.
One of the bullet points here is affordability covenants, and there are people from Small Housing BC on this call that I'm sure recognize that bullet point. But one of the things that we didn't, you know, discuss as part of the presentation or as part of the research we've done so far, I think, is this notion that if 4 units is what's allowed as of right, how can one, in the same way that Victoria, for instance, is talking about a density bonus, where that's tied to certain affordability metrics, that your number of units allowed or the maximum building height might increase from 3 to 4 stories or from 4 units to 6 units if those additional units and then additional height was provided as affordable housing with, you know, a covenant tied to it. Those are discussions that we took this project on as we're going to take the zoning box for a house and we're going to see what could go in that with a cap at 4. But a discussion around you know, tying affordability incentives to a density beyond the 4 units is something that Small Housing BC can probably talk in more detail about, but we're really interested in.
I think it's also important that we use the kind of EHON targets for the range of housing types that we looked at. But there's also one of the interesting potential with this kind of conversion of an existing house to a multiplex through renovation and additions, is within that new multiplex to have everything from, say, a really well-designed bachelor unit to a 2-family unit. And that kind of spread of housing size and type within one building creates a much better kind of community, both for that one house and as an aggregate in the neighborhood, as opposed to what typically happens now where you have silos of, you know, rooming houses or bachelors or that kind of thing. And then housing is, family housing is something different. So the affordability issue is one that I think it has a broad spectrum to it.
There's one other question that asks whether Toronto conducted analysis of infrastructure capacities and impact related to increasing the number of units on these lots. So we have a kind of interesting condition in Toronto where over the last probably like 15, 20 years, there's actually been decreasing populations in our downtown neighborhoods. There's the vast majority of, I think, what would be determined affordable rental units within the city are actually illegal multiplexes that have been converted. And as people are purchasing either forming rooming houses or reconverting these illegal conversions back to very large single family houses, and family sizes are dropping, and kids are moving out of downtown neighborhoods, and you go from a kind of like 4-family household to a 2-person household. We've actually seen significant reductions in populations within the downtown neighborhoods, which has in some cases resulted in schools closing. So there's historically a fair amount of evidence that there is capacity within the neighborhoods to handle this amount of people. I don't know specifically a study that the City of Toronto has done to point you to, but there's been a lot of people looking at it from that perspective.
I'll mention briefly the condition of kind of downtown being saying having excess capacity with schools and such because of decreased population is a suburban issue as well. And I think there's a lot to say about this. So we'll just say, you know, a lot of folks owning homes, especially in the inner suburbs, are retiring. Their kids have moved out. The schools in many areas are actually under pressure to close. And I think the city has a blanket assumption that in suburban areas, due to this demographic condition, that there is too much infrastructure, not too much, but more than enough infrastructure to support the housing. That being said, as Sam has mentioned, I think, you know, driving down any street in suburban Toronto, you'll find a lot of evidence of rooming houses or multi-unit or multi-generational families, for example, with like lots of cars in the driveway or garbage piled up, which shows that perhaps there's a lot going on that's not being counted. So I think one of the exercises, in addition to kind of doing the infrastructure capacity research, is actually seeing if we can assess the amount of informal or unaccounted basement suites and multi-unit dwellings that are already being built. But I think that's a great question. Jana, I know, is super interested in thinking about from a hydrological perspective as well. So that's been another point of discussion.
Recognizing the time here, and we're a little bit over 11 o'clock, so maybe we should just answer perhaps one last question before wrapping it up.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I see a question on lifespan of buildings, which is interesting because a lot of houses when they were built in the 60s and 70s had a lifespan associated with them of 50 years, and it's now 2020s, and so technically those buildings should no longer stand. But of course, what I think we realize is that it's really a question of what was the maintenance regime, and how well was the roof taken care of against leakage and all these nuances. And so saying that a building built out of wood is can last 50 years, or can a building out of concrete can last 200 years is a statement that completely disregards the way it's maintained and the way it's cared for in a sense. And so a lot of buildings that were built in the 60s were well maintained, and today they're totally suitable for a second floor addition or a rear addition, or it's so dependent on project specificness when it comes to renovations and additions. But there certainly is the potential, a building that was built in the 70s, many of them are in good enough condition that with a bit of work can stand for the next 100 years. So it's an extremely nuanced question, I guess, which was interesting when we did this project, because realizing that the medium and high options have so much potential, but so much nuance that's site and project specific. So yeah.
Okay, with that, I will thank everyone for attending the session today. I hope you found it very valuable. We will be providing the copy of the presentation to this group, and we'll work on the recording at a later point in time. So with that, thank you so much.
Thanks all.